Okay, we are go. So very quickly to introduce Sam without embarrassing him too much. Dr. Sam Shepherd is our partner at Total Endurance Nutrition, where we offer athletes a fully structured nutrition program to complement the training that we put together. And he also does our physiological testing at Liverpool John Moores University, along with Jules Strauss. So this session is linked to that and builds upon some of the work that you've done on there, Sam. And quite a bit of this is new to us as well. So interesting for the coaches who are on board as well tonight. I'm literally handing over to you now, Sam, and you can go.
Thanks, mate. Thanks. Evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. It's quite a late one, this, isn't it? 7:30 compared to normal, but yeah. Evening. I hope everyone's doing well. So one of the things that we're going to, try and talk to you about today, as you can see on the screen, is this idea of athlete resilience, also termed durability, and how important this is in endurance sport in general, but I think very specifically triathlon as well, as we move from swim, bike to run. So this, as TC said, this builds on some of the work we do with people who come to visit us for just some physiological testing. And over the last probably few years, we've questioned us and other people around the world have questioned how important the physiological testing in its current state actually is. And there's some great sort of examples in the real world of how this idea of athlete resilience is kind of like what we might term like the fourth dimension of sort of physiological testing. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about that tonight, and then I just want to finish off really with a bit of a recruitment drive, I suppose, because we've got a study that's running at Liverpool John Moores University on this topic to try and start to answer some of the questions that we've got around this. So the first sort of thing I'll do is just introduce the sort of physiological testing and why we might do this, what it actually is. So apologies if this is a repeat for some people, but it's good to just touch upon what we're trying to achieve when we do this kind of physiological testing or profiling of athletes in the lab. And really what we're trying to do here is to assess these key aspects of physiology, which we can then use to inform how we then train. It might inform the nutrition alongside that training, or even the strategy within a race itself. And ultimately, we're going to use that information to optimize the approach we've got leading up to a race, and hopefully that will then lead to an improvement in performance, in whatever race that is. So that's really what we're trying to achieve with any physiological testing that we're doing. And the other question, I suppose, that we get asked quite often is, oh, who's it for? And everyone thinks, well, it's just targeting, elite athletes really, or the best athletes will get the most from it. And that's really not true. We're all pushing to improve our performance at whatever level we are. We all want to go faster and push more power on the bike. So really, physiological testing isn't a test it's a test to benchmark where you're at, but also understand what is limiting your performance. Maybe you need to improve your aerobic base or something like that, or maybe it's the lactate threshold that we need to push up. And it's about understanding what variables that we can target in training to try and improve performance, and the specific variables. The other thing that it's useful for, if you do this repeat times through a season, is then you can track progress over time. So the optimal approach is that you come to the lab, whether that's LJMU or somewhere else in the UK or the world, and go undertake some of this physiological profiling testing. And then you go away, do a block of training, you might race, come back and see where you're at again. And then you can see what improvements you've made, and then decide on another way forward, whether you still build on what you've been doing or change direction slightly. And the last point on that slide there, I think, is probably the most important one. We're not generally elite athletes who have a lot of time. We're trying to balance jobs, other aspects of life, family, around the training that we're doing. So ultimately, if we know what is limiting our performance, we know our weaknesses, then ultimately, we can build the most optimal or effective training program, and then you're going to get the most out of the time that you put into that. So, getting the most out of the time that you train, basically, is what we're trying to achieve with a lot of this. And I suppose this is the other question that you get asked quite a lot is, can't I just do an FTP test? And we could interchange FTP test there for a swim, a 400-meter swim test, for example, or a 5K run test. And you can, and that gives you some information. And we know that, an FTP test, for example, is just giving you an idea of your 20-minute power, 95% of your 20-minute power to estimate FTP. And it gives you some idea on power and heart rate zones that you can, then use to prescribe training. And what we're actually measuring when we measure FTP is, roughly speaking, the lactate or anaerobic threshold. And obviously the equivalent power or heart rate that's required to push that or achieve that. The limiting factor, I suppose, of an FTP test is that you can arrive at that power or at that heart rate in two very different ways. So this is just an example of two representative athletes, let's say, that actually have the same FTP, but they generate the work or the power in two slightly different ways. So what I mean by that is the proportion of energy that is derived from aerobic metabolism, and then the proportion that is derived from anaerobic metabolism. And so if we put those two athletes side by side and we just did an FTP test, well, they've got the same FTP, in theory, they're a very, very similar athlete, but there's slight differences in how they generate that energy and arrive at those power numbers. And that's where physiological testing can provide sort of additional information. So if you know that you generate that energy a lot more anaerobically, then beyond 20 minutes, you're probably going to, really tail off. Maybe someone who continues at that power or slightly below that power, that has a high proportion of energy derived from aerobic metabolism, might then be able to continue and sustain that maybe up to 45 or 60 minutes or something like that. So it gives you this, extra dimensions of information, let's say. And we can look at, what are the extras essentially on top of understanding what your FTP is. So a lot of these are critical as well to triathlon performance. So, for example, we know lactate threshold or your anaerobic threshold is incredibly important. But we're also able to generate a lot of other information. So firstly, VO2 max or fitness, the size of your engine, however you want to term it, the number that you can go and brag about in the pub, or down the triathlon club or at the swim club, then that's a really good number to know, and be able to benchmark yourself against. But it's not the only important determinant of triathlon performance. We're also interested in the aerobic threshold as well, which I'll touch upon in a few slides time, and how we generate that. And people are learning a lot more about these terms as well, I should say. And we've talked about lactate threshold and we've talked about aerobic threshold, but the interaction and the relationship between the two is really important as well, and defines you as an athlete almost, to a degree. Hopefully your lactate or your aerobic threshold and your lactate threshold are far enough apart that you're not, that's what you want to achieve. You want to get them a fair distance apart so that you can, be able to train specifically on one area rather than a session combining the two, if they sit quite closely together. And then from a nutrition perspective, we can also look and benchmark in terms of your reliance on carbohydrate at different powers and different speeds on the treadmill. And then also, and again, people who've listened to me talk a lot will hear me talk about the importance of being a good fat burner and how important that is as a determinant of triathlon performance, particularly when we move to 70.3 and Ironman distance and beyond. Your ability to burn fat is, absolutely critical. And there's a few studies now showing how important it is as a determinant of your performance. So the greater fat burner you are, essentially the faster you will go in a race. So how do we typically do this? Apologies, I had to try and get a picture of my dog into the talk tonight, and this is where I've managed to shoehorn it in. But how we typically would go about doing some testing, well, the first thing, we would have probably 2 or 3 fairly easy days leading into the session. So you're in a fairly low fatigued state coming into the testing, and that's always been the approach that you would get the most out of this type of testing, on fairly fresh legs. But we're beginning to question how important that is, or how relevant that is to your training, and maybe having some level of fatigue, which we'll kind of talk about in a little while, might be really useful to give you even more information about what type of athlete you are, or the limiters to your performance. So then you've had your 2 or 3 fairly easy days leading into the test, and then the test itself, broadly speaking, at least here, is split into 2 parts. First part, we do a lactate threshold test. You start off at a fairly low intensity, either on the bike, fairly low power, or fairly low speed on the treadmill. These are sort of interchangeable, I suppose. And then every 4 minutes, the power or the speed on the treadmill will increase by a certain amount. And we'll collect expired air to work out your rates of carbohydrate and fat burning at each of these different powers or speeds. And we'll also take a lactate sample from either the finger or the ear to start to plot a lactate curve. And you continue to exercise, whether that's on the bike or on the treadmill, until your lactate goes above 4 millimoles per litre, which is this kind of theoretical lactate threshold number. And certainly beyond, when your lactate goes beyond 4 millimoles in the blood, then it will, and you continue to increase the intensity, then the lactate will just go up exponentially. So that's the kind of lactate threshold that we would traditionally think of. So we've done that part of the test. We have 10 or 15 minutes recovery, and then the second part is the kind of VO2 max part, the one where you can generate the number to brag to your friends around. And basically it's the same protocol. Start off at fairly low intensity, and this time it just goes up every minute, and we just ramp that up until you can't run anymore, or you can't cycle anymore, until you've reached sort of fatigue, and take your VO2 max number at that point. So broadly speaking, that's what the test will kind of look like. One of the things I should have said in the previous slide is, through the first part of the test, we're also able to generate information on efficiency. And what I mean by that is something like cycling efficiency or run economy, you might also have heard of. And basically that's the oxygen cost to run at a certain speed. And again, that can be used to benchmark and against like the norms, let's say, and see where you're at, which is important as we go through the talk here, just to mention that. So some of the outcomes that we generate from this type of testing, well, first of all, we're interested from a performance perspective, as I said, in the ability to burn fat. And so we can calculate how much fat you burn at each of those different workloads, or if you're running each of those different speeds on a treadmill. And this is the kind of curve that we generate. So as the intensity goes up, whether that's through power or through an increase in speed on the treadmill, then initially you'll get a rise in your fat oxidation rates, or your fat burning rates, and that reaches a peak, and then it will start to go down as the intensity goes up and up and up, and you start to rely more on carbohydrate. This number here, this peak fat oxidation or maximal fat oxidation number, again, is really important for benchmarking purposes. It can give us an idea of how good you are or poor you are as a fat burner. And as I said, that has clear implications for endurance performance. So if you are a poorer fat burner, then you are basically going to run out of your stored carbohydrate in the body at a much faster rate compared to someone who is a good fat burner. So, if you're looking at the elite athletes, they're probably got fat burning rates were put around at least 0.8 and beyond, 0.8 grams per minute, whereas some of the people we have in the lab might be down at like 0.2, even 0.15, something like that. So there's quite a range there, but it has, big implications on performance. And this is one of the outcomes that we're really interested in. And then we can come up with different strategies to try and improve that, whether that's just through an increase in training volume. Well, that's obviously not always possible for age group athletes, or we can think about specific nutritional strategies to target specific sessions that are then going to increase that rate of fat burning. Probably the kind of key thing that we get from this type of testing is the lactate threshold. So this again is the typical kind of curve, if we like, that we would generate during the whole test. So again, as we start to increase the power or the workload, then we have a fairly low level of lactate, and then we're looking for what we call inflection points in this curve, basically. The first one is looking to see where that first inflection point is, and that would be called lactate threshold 1 or LT1, and then LT2, as we're becoming probably more aware of these terms thanks to the Norwegians, is what we would term the sort of anaerobic threshold. So typically when we think of lactate threshold, more often than not, we're talking about LT2 or this anaerobic threshold. And that, as I said right at the start, is that point at which after your lactate would just accumulate exponentially. And you can work out what the power is for that and also the heart rate for that. The first lactate threshold, or LT1 or aerobic threshold, is basically defined as an increase of 1 millimole above baseline, or the lowest lactate value that we get during the test. And that's that first inflection point that I was talking about. And this is a really important one because it gives us an indication of how aerobically trained or the aerobic capacity that someone might have. And so using those, LT1 and LT2, we can then begin to think about how you prescribe training, whether we're trying to train below LT1 to improve the aerobic base. Maybe we want to push LT1 up and we do some blocks of training where you work just above this power value. So it might be something like, for this person, 260 to 270 watts. And then that will you're trying to pull up LT1 slightly. Similarly, you might, find that you want to push LT2 up. So again, you do a lot of work like above and below. So over-unders is the kind of classic session that you might prescribe for trying to improve LT2, or periods of VO2 max work, something, 3 or 4 minute intervals to try and really push that LT2 up, and that your maximum VO2 max as well, should I say. And ultimately, when you in a very simplistic way, we can start to inform the training zones in this way. And I know there's a number of different ways that we can define training zones, or even the term training domains. So we'll often think about these sort of 3, 4, 5 zone models. I've just put the example of 3 zones here just to keep things simple, and it works out quite well with where the lactate thresholds lie as well. Or the term domains as well. So we have the moderate intensity domain, a heavy intensity domain, and then a severe intensity domain. So the moderate is below LT, or up to and below LT1. Heavy is from LT1 to LT2, and then severe is above LT2. But keep this in mind in these zones, and have a rough idea of where these LT1 and LT2 values are, because we'll kind of touch upon the importance of those numbers as we move into the second part of this talk, where we're thinking about how we might modify the physiological testing as people are describing or thinking of doing moving forward. So what I wanted to say was that this physiological testing that I've described there is used, in labs across the world, really, and at all levels, as I said right at the start. And they did many of these tests as part of the selection process for Breaking 2, as a really good example here. So they got all of the athletes that they were thinking of selecting for Breaking 2 into the lab to put them through these tests, basically. And that's because there's in the marathon, at least, and I would also say in endurance sport in general, there's 3 performance predictors. So based on the numbers that you get for these values, or for these predictors, you can then get a pretty good idea on the speed and time that you would run for a marathon, or you would complete a time trial, for example, or something like that. So one of those is VO2 max. So clearly you have to have a very big engine, high capacity to use and consume oxygen to be able to perform at this high level. So that's one of the performance predictors. But we also have percentage of VO2 max at LT2. And in layman's terms, or more simpler terms, this is the proportion of the engine or your aerobic capacity which is required to run at threshold. The ideal scenario is that you could run at LT2 maybe at 90-95% of your VO2 max. So you'll be be running very fast or cycling pretty fast if you're able to do that. And for the guys that did running 2, just out of interest, they had a percentage, I think it was something like 68% of VO2 max at LT2, all the way up to 98% at LT2. So these are all elite runners, but you can see there's such a variation in that particular predictor there. And then the third one, obviously specific to the marathon here, was running economy. And this is just the oxygen, or using at a very simple level, it's the oxygen or energy cost of running at different speeds. And we have specific speeds that we're interested in using when we think about and compare between athletes for run economy. And so for Breaking 2, all the athletes underwent these tests, and these variables were defined and determined for those guys. And there was 3 that were, as we know, were selected to try and attempt to go under 2 hours on that first attempt. And so we've got Zerenise, Tedeschi, Kipchoge, and then Lalisa Desisa. Those were the 3 that were selected. And ultimately, they had very, very similar VO2 max levels, percentage of VO2 max at LT2, and also running economy. And that's why they were selected. They were the highest, but they were all at a very similar level. And when you then predict the speed that they could run the marathon at, theoretically, they should all be able to go very close to or under 2 hours. And that's why they were selected to go on that first attempt. Now, this is where the idea of durability or resilience comes in. So, and we'll describe a little bit more about what that actually is. But ultimately, when we look at the results of that first attempt, well, we know that Kipchoge got very, very close, 25 seconds or 26 seconds shy of going sub 2 hours. However, Tadise did nearly 2:07, and then Desisa 2:14, and they were still racing at that point. They weren't just, they didn't just drop off the pace and sack it off. Like they wanted to press on and try and run as fast as they could. So despite having all very, very similar characteristics from a laboratory-based test, Kipchoge was still able to go 7 or 14 minutes faster than Tadise and Desisa, respectively. So this got us thinking in the endurance world about why that might be. And one of the reasons might be this idea of durability or resilience. And how we define that is not easy. At the moment, we've arrived at this definition, which is the degree of deterioration in physiological variables which determine performance. And what we mean by that is it's the deterioration in 1 or 2 or 3 of these. Now, ultimately, VO2 max isn't going to change too much during a 2-hour event, but the percentage of VO2 max at LT2 might shift as a function of time, and certainly running economy might deteriorate as a function of time as well, and we would expect that. But it's that capacity to be resilient to the decrease in running economy, or resilient to the percent or a decrease in the percentage of VO2 max at LT2, which then means that probably Kipchoge is more able to, and now able to go under 2 hours for the marathon compared to the other 2 guys running the event. So what the task is now is actually, what we're trying to work out is what factors come together to contribute and help, basically make up this idea of durability or resilience of an athlete. And so we've talked about it in the context of a marathon there, but we can think about it in triathlon, and I think it really holds true because of the 3 sports that we're undertaking in triathlon. We're going from a swim to a bike to a run. So, and we always say you've got to race the whole race. You can't just do, think about these things in isolation. How you perform in the swim is going to have an impact on your bike, and equally how you bike is going to have an impact on your run. And I think this idea of durability in triathlon is based on that, really. And I think particularly moving from the bike to the run is a really interesting question. So how you ride your bike, as we know, is going to affect how you run, but understanding how it affects people differently, and also what factors mean that you can't necessarily translate what you do in a fresh training session on the run, compared that to what you might do in a race, for example, is a really interesting question to tackle. So this is, I guess I'll start by saying we're recruiting for a study to try and tackle this question and understand this question. So we're asking you guys how resilient you are, and that's what we're trying to determine really in the first instance. So we're after males and females. Sorry about the upper age limit of 50. Just having a bit of experience in triathlon as well for a couple of years is fine. And we're after all different types of individuals here as well. So you don't have to be a specific fitness. We're after a range here. But I'll come back to this slide at the end. So just to describe what we're trying to do here and what's involved. Well, ultimately it's 4 visits to the lab to try and tackle this question. So the first one, we will do a lactate threshold and VO2 max test on the bike, as I described at the start. Second one, we'll do just a threshold and run economy test. So you don't have to go all the way to fatigue, you'll be pleased to know, on that second test. And then what we've got is 2 what we call experimental trials, really. So we're trying to understand how just at a sort of endurance ride, so 2 hours riding at sort of LT1, which should be sustainable for 3 or 4 hours for most people, how that then influences your run economy. So you'd ride for 2 hours, and we've got 2 different trials here, which I'll talk about in a minute. You ride for 2 hours, jump off the bike onto the treadmill, and then we'll look at your run economy and compare that to the second trial that we did, where it was just like a fresh run economy test. So we're looking there at how fatigue from the bike will impact your run economy. And we've got 2 different trials here. So the reason for this is that we often in science will just keep it very simple and go, well, we'll just do a constant power on the bike for 2 hours, which is fine. And it's somewhat representative if we think about what we do on maybe a flat course, that you just hold a certain power number for 4, 2, 3, whatever, however long you're racing for, and that's okay. But it's a little bit limited, really, in the thinking and the practicality leading into the real world, let's say. So we're also doing what we call a variable power assessment as well. the reason for this is that power delivery, as I'm sure the coaches have discussed with athletes and already, is really important in executing a good bike leg in triathlon, but it will also potentially determine how it affects your run economy. Now, the obvious thing to think about here is that if you hold a constant power, there's no spikes, it's pretty nice and straightforward, then when you get off the bike, your run economy should be pretty good. Compare that to a variable power, like the profile on the bottom. There's a lot of spikes in there. This, it might be like you're going up a hill, up and down a hill, something like Staffordshire 70.3 is a really good example here of like an undulating course. You've got power spikes, particularly as you're going through Cannock Chase, something like that. And again, the sort of obvious thinking would be, well, you get off the bike and your run economy might suffer a little bit more. Now, there's a number of factors that we think will affect your run economy after the bike leg. So one of these is muscle fiber recruitment. So you have different muscle fibers in your legs, in all the muscles in your body, and they have different oxygen requirements, and they will also impact the fuels that we use as well. And so at a constant power, the level of muscle fiber recruitment and the types of muscle fibers that you are recruiting is fairly limited. Compare that to like a variable power. You'll be recruiting a number of different fiber types and a broader range of fibers within the muscles, really. And so actually what we think might happen is that when you have a variable power delivery, it will actually impact your run economy less compared to like a constant power. So this is just a hypothesis at this point, and this is the reason that we're doing the study, to try and work this out. So putting that together, and you probably sat there thinking, well, why on earth is this important for me? Well, I'll try and tell you. So the results from this study, so if you came and take part in this study, but also if you sought to do this yourself, then I think we can probably have a discussion about how you might do this in just in training or something like that. Well, it can give you some idea on how to approach your long duration training session. So the reason I say that is, and if we think back a few slides to where I had the lactate threshold figure and the different training zones, well, we know that your training zones might shift slightly as duration of a session increases. So during your endurance ride, so if you try to hold the same power throughout, you might start to drift into different, into higher training zones based on your heart rate, based on the stress that it's putting through your body. And so we have to think about how durable you are and try to avoid that happening. It's the classic, you go out for an easy ride and you get back and you're absolutely done in because it's become a hard ride, partly through either the duration or the intensity of that ride and that training zone transitioning. Sometimes we want that to happen, but a lot of the time we don't. We want to avoid that from happening because it's going to impact how you adapt to the session and ultimately subsequent sessions where you might be fatigued and you can't back them up. So that's one of the reasons that we want to try and tackle this, and the information that you can get from this study for you to support your own training. As we talked about as well, physiological testing is a lot about identifying weaknesses. And so we can look at the traditional kind of predictors of performance and think, right, okay, is there weaknesses in those? How can we improve those? But we can also look at this aspect of durability as well and start to understand how the bike is basically going to impact your run economy in a race. And so that's, for me, really powerful information that I can give to you. As we talked about, how power is delivered will also affect your race performance. And so that's going to have implications for how the strategy that you use in racing. So, for example, I know some of us at the moment are doing a lot of big gear work, and that's to support how we deliver power. And that will ultimately also have an effect on the types of muscle fibers that we recruit. So it might be that you alter, that we learn from this that power delivery is really important, and how you deliver that power might have a beneficial impact on your run economy. And so if that's true, then we can think about, well, maybe on a flat course we need to vary our cadence, for example, to get to try and improve the performance in the run. It's just one of the implications. And then we can also think about nutrition strategies. Of course, I'm always thinking about nutrition here, but maybe we need to target fat metabolism for you in some aspect of your training. And then also we can think about what your carbohydrate requirements are for racing as well, and get a good idea of that. So there's quite a lot of, for me, information that we can provide you by taking part in this study, but also just generally for those that aren't around the Northwest area, just by simply going and having some physiological testing done, then you can certainly get a lot of this information in that way as well. So I'll leave this up here for now. There's two of my MSc students who are actually leading this project. Tamara and Henry are on the call as well. So what I will do is probably post into the various groups and Facebook, and if you've seen this or part of this poster already, their contact details are on that. But beyond the study, I'm also happy to discuss questions and ask questions, answer any questions that you may have. So feel free to fire away. I'm going to stop sharing and then everyone can speak.
John Barrett, you can ask your question in real life if you want.
No, he can't. He's on mute.
Actually use real words. When are you running the trial, and how long do you expect it to take? Obviously, gathering the information and then coming up with an answer or some theories for everybody is a bit different. But when's this happening?
It's happening as of now. So we are recruiting now, ready to go. So Henry and Tamara awaiting emails from everyone, but probably expect it'll take 6 months or so, depending on how many willing volunteers step forward, basically. So if you want to come over 4 times
and with that, what's the spacing on the tests?
Yeah, so it's about 4 or 5 days. That's the only issue, as a minimum. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey, Kat.
Hi, I've got a question.
Yeah.
Hello. What would be an example of a nutrition strategy that would increase fat burning?
Okay. So the obvious way, apart from doing more training, because volume of training is king in this respect, but we can think about potentially doing like some types of fasted training, or limiting carbohydrates around certain sessions or for part of sessions as well. So we've put some information out before about like the endurance rides on a Wednesday. So they're often early, like Claire does a great job by getting everyone up and early on the bike on a Wednesday morning. So depending on how long that session is, you could tackle that either all before breakfast, or you could start with maybe a protein shake if you get particularly hungry or you need something in the belly for the first hour, and then you switch to carbohydrates. If you've got a super long ride, then I think the volume takes care of itself in some respects to improve fat metabolism. There's other strategies where we might kind of do it by accident as well. So if we have 2 sessions in a day, so something like Threshold Thursday, for example, or if we have 2 VO2 max sessions on a Tuesday, you might actually start that second session in a bit of a glycogen depleted state just by chance. If you don't really refuel after the first session like super well, then you would start to, be burning more fat. But it would, when it's a VO2 max session, it would impact the quality of that session as well. So you don't really want to do that. But you might do it by accident, if that makes sense. But yeah, there's a few different ways we can approach that.
Thank you very much.
Sam, it's Gaynor.
Go on, Gaynor. Kat, I'll come to you next.
Now, I'm not sensitive, but how close to 50 will you tolerate? Only because I'm going on garden leave for the next 3 months. So if it's it might be of interest, but I'm really not offended if you get people that are younger.
Yeah, sorry, it's 50 is the upper limit at the moment, getting it.
Maximum 50. So if I'm 50, it's no good.
Oh, if you're 50, then you're okay, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not 50 yet, Sam. Bloody hell, you cheeky sod.
Yeah, I'm just squeezing in there as well.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah,
well, I've already had an earful off Rosie about it, but yeah.
No, I'm not 50 yet, but I am 50 in 4 weeks' time.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, we'll get you signed up, Gaynor, don't worry.
Right, okay, cool. Only because I'm on garden leave, so I've got nothing to do. So
fair enough. Oh yeah, definitely. Go on, Kat.
Hey, am I okay to just maybe give like a point from I just feel like the lay audience that might be actually really like high level practicing athletes are receptive to this might not necessarily understand the term eumenoric, and it might put them off. Also, if you define that in terms of, are you looking at menstruation every 3 months, or are you expecting monthly? Because you're not gonna get females that are super consistent, or I'm just wondering, there's just a bit, I feel like seeing that, I'm just if you want to hit the right audience, I'm not sure about that statement.
Yeah, so
but I think that the leaflet looks super good apart from that, and I've shared
so it was we'll look at basically 2 or 3 months, but it would just be through a conversation rather than tracking before get people started, basically. Yeah.
Cool. Sounds good. Hope you get lots of people.
Sam.
Hello.
Hiya, Sam. It's Luella.
Hello.
I'm slightly in the dark. You can't really see me. Sorry. You were talking about the training zones and domains, of the moderate, heavy, and severe. But in terms more of workload, sort of in watts. So would that not work for heart rate too, or?
Yeah. Sorry, yeah. So it'd be the heart rate zones would be fine, or it's just at LT1 or at LT2, this is your power and this is the heart rate. So you can whatever variable or data you want.
It's just because obviously sometimes you're going to get, if it's, well, I guess it's because with the heart rate drift, you're then going to maybe slip into a different zone. So if we're trying to maintain a sort of a steady watts through a session, should we then back off if our heart rate is starting to drift?
I think it depends on what the aim of that session is, and also so let's say you want to train just below LT1. If you drift just above LT1, then that's probably okay. If you continue to drift up to LT2, that's when it becomes a very different session. Mm-hmm. So it's just about, and I think this is probably a note for the coaches as well as the athletes, is understanding or making sure that athletes understand what the session aim is, and ultimately also what sessions are coming as well. So you'll know yourself, if you go and ride too hard and you're out for 4 hours and your heart rate drifts up and you do more power than you want to, then the session 2 days later that you want to try and hit, a track session, for example, it's just not going to happen, is it? To the set, or how you want it to. So you've got to think about what the sessions are that are coming, and that's the reason I make that point, is that we're going to expect some cardiac drift, of course, and heart rate is going to move up slightly, but it's just about understanding where the limit of that is as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sam, quick question. So when you talk about durability and resilience, do you think this is purely a physiological thing that you can see in numbers, or how much is well, Kipchoge's got 8 or 10 years on these guys and he's just got a little bit more muscular resilience, or he's psychologically a bit tougher, he can buffer waste products a bit more, not necessarily the whole shuttling of things, but how much is the mental, physical? Have you got any ideas?
No, but I completely acknowledge that this isn't entirely physiological. There will be a psychological aspect to it, and there will also be a time in the sport, a sport experience element to it as well. Without doubt. So that's some of the information that we'll collect on that last point. We're not psychologists, so we'll leave the psychologists to do that down the line. But that's probably, it is an important part of it, of course. Yeah.
Well, I imagine the end of any kind of trial is to get to the end and be able to ask another set of questions, or accurate questions. Yeah. Thank you.
Sadie, I've just seen your question. I'm afraid it's only happening in the Northwest, I'm afraid. But the point of the talk was also to highlight the physiological testing in general. So, there might be a local university that also does this local to you, or a specific centre as well. These things happen all over the world, really. So there are opportunities, but for the specific study, at least, just the Northwest, I'm afraid. Awesome. If anyone's got any questions, then say so now. If not, then you can go and eat your tea. Or grab a glass of wine, Gaynor.
I've already got one, Sam.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you, Sam.
great. Thank you.
This is recorded. We will put this recording out, and Sam will also repost the information about joining the study, I think, won't you? So people have got a chance to do that.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for joining and listening. That was good.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam. Cheers, mate.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Really informative.
Bye.
Thank you, Sam.